It is day 18 of the war with Iran, and here's where things stand. 13 U.S. soldiers have been killed. More than 200 troops have been injured. More than 2,000 people are dead across the Middle East. The Israeli military says it has killed a top leader of the Iranian regime, raising the possibility that hardliners there will double down on fighting the war. Here at home, as gas prices continue to rise and Trump's chief economic advisor insists that the impact on the average consumer is the last of the administration's concerns, the divide inside the MAGA movement over Iran is raging. It has burst wide open with a high-profile resignation today. Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center and a top advisor to the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, announced his resignation on X today. In a letter, he writes this, quote, "I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. I support the values and the foreign policies that you campaigned on in 2016, 2020, 2024, which you enacted in your first term. Until June of 2025, you understood that the wars in the Middle East were a trap that robbed America of the precious lives of our patriots and depleted the wealth and prosperity of our nation." In the Oval Office today, Donald Trump said that Kent is wrong about Iran not being a threat and that he was, quote, "weak on security," which raises the question of why Donald Trump appointed him to be one of his top national security officials in the first place. Now, Joe Kent is not someone that Donald Trump can just dismiss. He is not some sort of rhino or squish. He is as MAGA as they come. Donald Trump endorsed both of Mr. Kent's failed runs for Congress. Kent is an election denier through and through. He peddled the fringe conspiracy theory that the FBI instigated the January 6th insurrection. He's appeared alongside far-right militia groups and associated with white nationalist Nick Fuentes. We covered him earlier this year on this program after the New York Times reported that he pressured intelligence analysts to alter a report about the Venezuelan government that did not fit the narrative being peddled by the Trump administration. Kent's resignation today, though, shows that Donald Trump cannot swat away the raging debate within his own coalition over the war in Iran. His own base is asking the same questions that a lot of other Americans are asking. Why are we at war with Iran? Why did we attack Iran when we did? What are the goals of the war, and how and when does it end? Washington Post is reporting today that if one of Donald Trump's goals was to spark regime change, the war has so far had the opposite effect. From that reporting, quote, U.S. intelligence assessments issued since the war began predict Iran's regime will remain intact and possibly even emboldened, believing it stood up to Trump and survived. That's according to two people familiar with the assessments. Those assessments were made before Israel's military announced it had killed top leader Ali Larijani in an airstrike. Iran's top national security official, Larijani, was at the head of a brutal and tyrannical regime that massacred protesters. But the New York Times reports this. Mr. Larijani's death would remove an influential pragmatist who was seen as having the clout to negotiate with the U.S., and it could embolden even more hardline Iranian leaders who believe that the Islamic Republic can only survive by doubling down. The debate over the war in Iran raging within Donald Trump's base as the war shows no signs of heading toward any of Trump's so far stated goals is where we start today. Anne Applebaum joins us. She's a columnist for The Atlantic. Also joining us, former director of the CIA, our senior national security and intelligence analyst, John Brennan's here, and staff writer at The Atlantic, contributor to The Atlantic daily newsletter, Tom Nichols is here. He is a professor emeritus of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, where he taught for more than 2 decades. Director Brennan, I start with you. Mr. Kent isn't the kind of person that we would platform and hold up, but it is a fascinating window from deep inside the government's own intelligence apparatus, and a very loud one in terms of dissent and calling out something that Marco Rubio so much has testified to this before Congress, that we are in Iran because we believe that Israel was going to strike Iran. But what do you make of his letter announcing his resignation today?
Well, first of all, Nicole, I think you captured well Mr. Kent's politics and how he trafficked in conspiracy theories and really was part of the MAGA heart and soul even before he came into the administration. And his resignation, in a very public way, I think is designed to have an impact and to send a signal that the MAGA base of Trump's coalition is fracturing, that he is wanting to be, I think, one of the first individuals to do this, to carry out a resignation like this so publicly in the midst of a war. And the National Counterterrorism Center, is the center that integrates the intelligence from across the intelligence community, including in terms of looking out for possible Iranian terrorist planning. So clearly, he is being now derided by a number of people in the White House, including by Mr. Trump. But it's clear that this base of MAGA, the ones that are so opposed to foreign interventions, which included Tulsi Gabbard and Vice President Vance. And it's going to be interesting to see what this does to Gabbard's standing with the White House, because Kent was basically an acolyte of Gabbard, was appointed to the position by Trump, but with Tulsi Gabbard's advice and recommendation. So it's clear that this is now a big concern for the White House because, again, this was done in such a public way at a time of great concern and including great criticism of the course of this war.
Tom Nichols, Mr. Kent writing this sort of sentence that'll live on forever. When the history of this chapter is written and the chapter on the war in Iran is written, I believe the sentence will be there. Quote, "I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby." So writes the first senior national security official to depart Donald Trump's isolationist political coalition in the aftermath of the Iran war being launched.
Well, the truest part of that was Kent saying that there was no imminent threat from Iran. There was no forcing function behind this war. It's not like we knew that they were days or weeks or months from a nuclear bomb, although now that is the talking point the president seems to be holding on to for dear life. Just today, he talked about if it had, but not for me, there would have been a nuclear holocaust. But of course, Kent adding that, this is really the Israelis dragged us into war shows that I think even the MAGA base doesn't really understand Donald Trump's personality, where everything is about the glory of Donald Trump. That, yeah, sure. I'm sure that that Netanyahu was whispering in Donald Trump's ear, "You'll be the liberator of Iran. This will be over. It'll be a cakewalk. It'll be, we'll smash the Iranian regime together." But Donald Trump, in the end, is responsible for Donald Trump's decisions. And he took this decision with a circle of people in the United States on his own accord. And I think what MAGA world is going to find out that tomorrow Donald Trump won't even remember who Joe Kent was, because none of these people matter to Donald Trump. They are just raw material for his ego and his narcissism. And I don't think this is going to have much of an impact on him. Unfortunately, it should, but it probably won't.
I mean, and what I think is interesting is learning where the lines are, right? So for this individual, Mr. Kent, the line wasn't a deadly insurrection wherein Donald Trump's supporters beat law enforcement, members of law enforcement. For Mr. Kent, the line wasn't, I believe the story that I mentioned in the lead was about his actions in being punitive because he wanted the intelligence community to have an assessment that held something along the lines of Venezuela as a state was doing something that would justify the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. I think that was, and if I have that slightly off, I'll be more precise in the break, but it was around this effort to invoke the Alien Enemies Act to deport people here without granting them due process. And so the line wasn't crossed for him in that. He found it suitable to try to massage an intelligence product to justify that. The line was, and again, I'll just read from his letter, was deviating from, quote, the policies you campaigned on in 2016, 2020, and 2024, which you enacted in your first term, until June of 2025. And, I always ask you, when autocracies, take over, what happens, and when they stumble, right? When the last sort of gasps of a democracy sort of reach back and pull them back from the brink, what happens? And fracturing within the coalition feels like something that always happens if an autocrat is going to stumble. How big of a deal is it to see someone walk away sort of for cause, for a policy disagreement like this?
So there are different kinds of people inside Trump's coalition, inside the people who work for the administration, and they're there for different reasons. I don't know Joe Kent, but from the tone of his letter and from his public statements, it's clear that he belongs to one of the people who has a very clear, very radical ideology. As you say, what mattered for him was this argument about wars in the Middle East. What didn't matter for him, for example, was how Trump treated Americans, how Trump used the language of dehumanization against immigrants, against his political opponents, against even soldiers fighting in the Middle East. He's not particularly interested in their humanity. He's not taking their fate seriously. None of that bothered him. What mattered to him was this one. This one line that he had interpreted Trump as being serious about. What MAGA people are learning is something that people outside of the coalition and outside of that coalition, outside of the administration, have been seeing for a long time, which is that actually, as Tom just said, Trump has no ideology. People impose their ideologies on him. They imagine that he's speaking for them or he's speaking in service of something that they believe. But actually, he does what he wants at any given moment. He doesn't really connect the past and the future. He doesn't think about the implications of his actions. He doesn't have a long-term strategy. And other people are expecting him to have that and are disappointed when he doesn't produce it.